So many guests. Look at this.
How many guests do we have? I want to know. I can't see it right now.
2 guests. 2 guests.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The ironic. So many guests.
Great. You scared us for nothing. Thanks.
There we go.
Okay. Cool. People are trickling in.
Cool.
How was everyone today?
Good. Also semi-frantic morning. Weirdly for a Friday, I feel like.
Yeah, right? I don't know what.
Yeah.
Fridays are usually chill in publishing, but not this one.
Mm-mm.
No, I had like something that came in that I had to like leap out of bed at 5:30 to take care of, and I'm exhausted but excited about it. But we can't talk about that. Let's hop right in. What do you say?
There are very few sort of like get up at 5 in the morning publishing emergencies. Those don't happen that often, right? This is often a slow-moving business. So
and a good news one too. So it'll be fun to talk about.
Maybe more on the West Coast, I guess. But
yeah,
that's true. That's true.
That is true.
Okay, everyone. Well, welcome to Agent Talk with Seth and Dongwan. This is a weekly live stream where, in theory, for this one is a little bit different, but yeah, 2 veteran agents, we come together, we talk about various aspects of the business in hopes that we can make the process a bit more transparent and accessible to new and inspiring agents. Remember this, this isn't exactly the place for those who want to be a writer. This is more of a place for people who want to be an agent. So if you're here hoping to find out how to get an agent, I'm hearing some echo here. Is that me or is that someone else here? I'm just wondering.
it sounded like a motorcycle, and it's really quiet where I am. So so I'm blaming
someone else. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so listen, the show's free. But if you're able, we'd appreciate it if you could kick in a couple of bucks to the link below to POC and Publishing, and we'd appreciate that. So we are going to talk. This is week 7 now, and we have talked about a lot of different things. And obviously, we're talking about how to get into publishing. So, what better way than to speak to 2 amazing, agents who have recently gone through the process. So today we have 2 guests on that we hope can shed a little light on what it's like to be, an agent's assistant and how it is to make the transition to full-time agenting. This is a really, really difficult and tricky step, perhaps the most difficult step in the agent's career. And I'm excited to talk about it because I don't think people fully get their mind wrapped around that. So we're really excited to welcome Sarah Balling and Kim May Kirtland to the show. Hello, everyone. Clap, 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 clap. Hello. So I can do introductions, but I'm not going to because you guys are better at that. So why don't you guys introduce yourself and then we'll hop right in.
Kim May, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kim May Kirtland. I started at the Howard Morheim Literary Agency as Howard's assistant in fall of 2013, which I don't want to think about too much. That feels like a long time ago now. And so from there, Howard encouraged me to move up and transition out of that role into being a full-time agent, which I am now, focusing on science fiction and fantasy, both adult and YA. So that is me.
And I'm Sarah. I'm Seth's colleague at the Gernert Company. I started about 3 years ago as an assistant, and I've also started building my list in about that same time frame. So, yeah.
On day 1, she was repping things.
Month 1, but yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I have a very eclectic list. I work on illustrated books. I work on nonfiction and fiction, literary fiction mostly. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, Sarah, I definitely want to hear about how you started repping people in your first month, but let's go back even a little bit more. Can you talk about how you got into publishing, sort of where you come from and why, you wanted to get in on the agenting side? I mean, was that always what you wanted to do? Did you want to do editorial? All of that?
Sure. Well, I was one of those college students who had no idea what they wanted to do afterwards. And I had a friend who worked at Norton and just encouraged me to do a publicity internship there. She was in the publicity department.
Can
So
you
I
tell
did
us what
that.
Norton is? Can you tell us what Norton is?
Oh, sure, of course. Norton is a publisher of trade books that sort of toe the line between trade and academic. So they also do fiction, but they're mostly known for their nonfiction and their college department, which works on textbooks and other things like that.
I have their edition of Paradise Lost back here, I think. The classic critical edition, yeah.
Yeah, I think anybody who has been through like English classes in college or even high school has had those books. I mean, they are for trade audiences, but they're used a lot in schools.
Yeah, the anthologies
they're like one of the bigger mid-sized independent publishers. You know what I mean? So
yeah. For context, there, I mean, like there's the big five, but then I would say there's HMH or Houghton Mifflin Harcourt and Norton are like 6 and 7. You know,
is it Houghton or Houghton?
I say Hoplin.
I don't say either of those. I say Houghton.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is.
I'm from
Welcome
Texas.
to publishing. You know,
Texas is not. It's a Texas. It's like Houston and Houston. You know,
Hachette books and heard Hatchet books all the time. You know, listen, I still am not quite sure how to say Knopf, and I've been in this business for my whole adult life.
Yeah.
Anyways, sorry.
I think this is what linguists would call vowel drift, but yeah.
Anyway, Norton. So I did some internships. I also interned at the Joy Harris Agency, which was a lot of fun. And I kind of decided there that I wanted to be an agent. And then I had a quarter life crisis and went to Asia and did a bunch of travel, and that's unrelated. But I came back and I did an internship at Gernert, which led to a full-time job at Norton in the trade editorial department, which led back to Gernert.
We said, go sow your oats at Norton, and then come
exactly.
back.
I do think wild oats.
And I recognize that I'm biased because I did this, but I think there's such value of understanding how a publisher works on the inside and then coming back to agenting. I love when I talk to younger, agents and younger folks in the business who've been on both sides and just they have such a more complete understanding of what everyone's thinking. So in other words, Seth and Kimei, you guys are screwed. Sarah and I are taking this over.
Wow.
Well, there's a reason why she started taking on things 1 month in. She wouldn't have been able to do that without that other set of experience.
Yeah. Kimei, why don't you tell us about how you got into the business? Sort of, what brought you into publishing and how you ended up working with Howard.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So this feels like it was very much by accident in a lot of ways. Good accidents, but yeah, there have been a lot of weird lucky breaks here. I do also want to acknowledge that we were both on Quarter Life Crisis team. That was a feature of my journey into publishing as well. So I actually had a full-time job in publishing, not in New York, before I decided I wanted to move back to the States and find a job in New York in publishing here. And so, yeah, I'm not going to do the whole freelance editing in college for money thing, part of my intro because it's boring. But suffice it to say that I got out of college and most of my job experience was freelance editing and working in bookstores. So I moved back to Singapore where I grew up, and was working full-time there at an academic publisher in their journals department, just making sure that as a production editor, so making sure that everything looked right, all the footnotes were in the right place, that images were where they should have been. Most of my stuff was dental journals, so I've seen a lot of weird pictures of teeth, a lot more than I really needed to see in life, I feel like.
I feel like it's a rough introduction to the books business, is looking at pictures of teeth.
There's a lot that can go wrong with your teeth. It is dangerous. So go to your dentist every 6 months if you can, and just do that whole thing.
Especially right now.
Maybe not right now. Maybe not right now. Yeah. So after about a year and a half in that job, I increasingly came to the conclusion that was not the part of the business I wanted to be in. And applying for jobs from Singapore in the States was not working at all, for a lot of reasons. So I thought maybe I should take some of this money that I've saved up, working this full-time job, living with my parents, and try and make a big move back to the States, which is how I found out about the Columbia Publishing course and went through that. And Shay Earhart, the program director, who is amazing and whose competence at that job is a little scary, sent me on a ton of interviews. I interviewed at Howard Moorheim, and I got that job, and I've been there ever since.
Were you scared about making that jump into the States?
I mean, I was lucky, I think, in that I have family in the States, though not in New York, and so I was able to, and I had a bunch of money saved up from working full time and living with my parents. So I felt like it was a risk that I could take.
Right.
Yeah, and it felt like, well, if this really doesn't work out, I know that I can get a full time job and go back to doing that. Like, I'll try something else.
Right. And I guess one of the reasons to ask that question is just like, that's one of the things that we are trying to look in the eye right now is like, is where people are at in terms of being able to step into publishing, how you can make any moves along those lines. So, just sort of acknowledgement that, it's a tricky step wherever you're at. So yeah. Okay. So you then started searching around. I mean, then you had the interviews, and that's when you got the job with Howard Moorheim.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was coming in as sort of as a replacement for someone who had not worked out in that job, who actually ended up getting a position. Well, ended up getting a position elsewhere in publishing and has done really well there. So I think it's a matter of finding the right fit in the industry too. But I came in and had exactly 3 days of training and had to figure out a lot of this on the fly. So that was interesting.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have the two of you on is that in a lot of ways, Gernert and HMLA are very different agencies, right? In terms of how we operate, what our day-to-day is, the scale of the businesses, things like that. HMLA, we now have 6 agents total, which is a really big increase, right? Like when I joined 5 years ago now, there were 3 of us and we sort of brought more people on and promoted Kim A. So I think all of those things kind of make a very different feel in terms of what the day-to-day is than maybe the scale at Gernert. In part, there's only one assistant for the whole agency, really, right? And Kim A, how would you characterize?
How does that even work? That's crazy talk. What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, like I don't have an assistant, right? Effectively, I do everything myself. The office admin, it doubles as Howard's assistant and running admin for the rest of us in terms of, payments and bookkeeping and those kind of aspects of the job. So, Kim A, do you want to kind of speak to what your day-to-day was like, if you can cast your mind back that far?
Yes. Yeah. I do still have working memory. Yeah.
Listen, I don't at this point, especially with the pandemic,
Yeah. Well, it's true. You are older than I am. So, yeah.
I love it.
I started, I will acknowledge that when I started, the job was smaller than it is now, I think, in that there were just fewer people in the office to support. And so what my day-to-day looked like, my title was executive assistant, so Howard's assistant as the president of the company, and office manager. So I was there 5 days a week. I answered 9:30 to 5:30, answered the phones. I did the first read on all of Howard's contracts to flag stuff for him that he might want to take a closer look at, and then he would go through and take and line by line read through all of them as well. So you had 2 sets of eyes on everything.
Before you move on, can I ask you about that really quick? Do you did you base that on like a boilerplate that Howard Moorheim would have, or so for each different major company they had a contract that y'all had base negotiations and you like compared side to side?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and then.
And did you feel like that was a good way to learn contracts and sort of what goes into them and how that works, or?
Yeah.
And would you like other leading questions?
I mean, sure, if you have them, but yeah. So yeah, I would go through and read and compare these things to documents that we already had, which in some ways feels like a very inefficient way to train not very smart AI, the AI being me. Like you look at the data you already have, and then you compare that to the stuff that you're being offered, and you're like, does this match? But also,
well, it wasn't even necessarily a leading question, actually, because, from my experience, when I was doing that as an assistant, I didn't learn anything from that process. I was just going through and being like, oh, this word is different. So, here, boss, this is different than the last one. You go deal with it. And it wasn't until I started having to actually negotiate what those differences were as an agent that, I started learning what those clauses actually meant and what mattered about the changes in wording, right? So, the reason I was asking for a genuine reason, thank you very much. No. But, even as an editor, I never had to look at the contracts really, right? That was just the contract department's job, right? So I was curious to see how much working on those did educate you in terms of like how the contracts are structured, what those clauses are, what those things mean, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. That's an interesting little difference then, because I feel like I definitely did read through a lot of these for the sense as well, just trying to figure out what all this meant. And another thing that after I'd been there, I think a few months, and Howard realized that he was not going to have to like bring on someone else. There's kind of a probationary period you go through in a new job where then your boss is like, okay, you actually can do this job, I think. So after the end of that, Howard started asking me to type up notes that he would look at for these contracts as well. Like this clause is different. And he would encourage me also to put in what I saw as the argument for it. A lot of what you're doing in agenting is saying, hey, we actually had this better version of this before. Can we have that again? And so Howard would encourage me to put in like a brief argument for why it should be the way it was. And then he would look at that and say, yeah, that makes sense. No, this is nonsense. So there was very hands-on training in that sense.
And what about you, Sarah? Sarah, how did you feel that onboarding and training process was? Do you feel like that you really learned a lot from like starting to do stuff, or did you feel more thrown into the deep end? Obviously, no one trying to throw the boss under the bus here, but just
he's not watching.
I guess I was thrown more into the deep end. I'm like struggling to think of like what my training might have consisted of, and I don't think there was any. But I do think it was. I mean, I had to learn quickly. So in some ways it was good, I think, because I just had to sort of, I also like ask questions, which is helpful. And I feel like my boss is very open to that. So I can like drop by his office anytime and ask him what this means or what I should do about a certain thing. But yeah, I was kind of thrown into the deep end and sort of had to figure out what I didn't know so that I could ask questions about it. Yeah.
I'm not sure that I wasn't thrown into the deep end a bit as well.
Right.
I mean, coming in to take over from someone who was in the job very briefly and didn't work out is not ideal, I feel like, but
by
yeah.
the time any assistant's hired, there's like 4 weeks of minimum of crap that's been sitting around that the boss doesn't want, didn't want to deal with, and it gets slugged on you. And one thing I think it's important to note here is it looks like all 4 of us had a role that was hybrid. And I think it's really important to note that. So I think that some people come in with a set of expectations. I'm going to be this right here. Well, I came in and I was 3 people's assistant and rotated in through the front desk. Dongwan was 1, but then rotated in through the front desk as well. I know Sarah has been up at the front desk, and it looks like Kim as well. So
I also literally sat next to the front desk. So I was de facto front desk.
Oh my
Every time someone went to the bathroom or whatever it was.
A number of times you could hear Dongwan like sigh throughout the office when you had to get up and walk around and walk over to the desk and answer. It was forever. It was wonderful. And I would also say, back to jump into the contracts thing, I think it's very interesting because I also had to do the crossover thing. I didn't really start learning anything until, I started negotiating some like audio contracts but that still didn't fully relate to the big ones. But then I sat next to for a little while, Sterling Lord had an in-house lawyer, and he was someone who didn't know how to work a computer very well. So, and it was his office was right next to mine. So I got called in all the time to like hand type everything, and he was like total old man mentor who would be like, what does this mean now that you typed it in? I was like, I got a job to do. Can you just let me go? But he would make me answer questions. But I learned so much from that. Yeah. And as much as I hate it, and that's the problem about it, is like you don't want to do things where like you don't want life to be this thing where you hate it, but then you're good at it. But that's the way I feel like contracts like have to be. There's a very lucky person who loves it from the ground floor.
Yeah.
I do kind of love it, actually.
I knew you would say that.
Yeah, sorry. Wait, is this a leading question?
No. You and I were on a contracts panel together, so I know your contracts abilities. They're quite astute.
I mean,
I will say you are very good and very sharp at those things, and it's been a real asset, I think, to the agency. So
Howard told me something that I thought was really a really interesting way to look at this early on, which was that a contract was a map of past arguments. And I thought, oh, this is great. You can negotiate this plan for how a relationship is going to go between the author and their publisher. And I really like that aspect of it.
The overly dramatic metaphor I use is that it's a map of scars.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm asking this question sort of is because, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, it's complicated, but publishing is very much an apprenticeship business, right? You learn from who you work for, and that is hugely dependent on who you work for, right? Seth and I work for very different people, just at complete opposite ends sort of the personality spectrum in a lot of ways. And so I think we had really different experiences. And, something that really stuck out to me that you said, Sarah, was, your willingness to ask questions, right? And I think for my first way too many years in the business, I was too intimidated by all the stuff I didn't know to ask the questions to find out what I didn't know. You know what I mean? And, my biggest regret of my time at Hachette over those 3 years was that I didn't ask questions. One of my colleagues would, on a monthly basis, take someone to lunch from some random department and sit them down and basically be like, okay, tell me about your job. What do you do? How do you do it? And all these things. And, I think it's made her into a complete powerhouse in the industry as a result, because she just understands a lot more about what everybody does than I ever did. So, I think if I have any piece of advice, not that this is an advice show, but just learn to ask questions. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I kind of had to let go of the feeling that I was asking something idiotic or that I was being stupid, because everyone's been in my situation before. And there are lots of things about the publishing industry that are really draconian and really opaque, that you probably won't ever learn if you don't just pinpoint it and ask. So
yeah, absolutely. And there's this thing that happens as well, and a lot of agencies have these meetings. It's good that they happen. It's it's like the interagency meeting where someone talks about deals or people they submit to or whatever. And the thing I noticed that happens there all the time is name usage without explanation, and it's really hard to just stop and pause and describe each person's role or whatever. But in our agency, especially, there's the name. It's almost like name dropping. It just comes left and right, and you really need to, as an assistant, if not in the meeting, then after with your boss, be willing to ask the question as to who is this person? Why am I submitting to this thing? Don't know all this stuff. And we're actually the first time I'll say it in this thing so far. We're going to talk a lot about that in the future, but it's key. Yeah. Okay, so we'll continue. I feel like we still haven't finished with y'all in terms of your day-to-day. So what are some things that we've missed in your day-to-day that you haven't had a chance to talk about, including the most boring, worst things? Are you ordering toilet paper for the office? What are we talking about here?
So one thing that I liked about my initial interview with Howard when we talked was that the boundaries between a personal assistant and an executive assistant were made fairly clear. I remember he explicitly said, "I'm not going to ask you to pick up my dry cleaning," that kind of thing. So I knew there would be kind of a floor on the amount of scut work nonsense that I'd be asked to do. But of course there's filing, there's filing. There is answering the phone if you get the person, you get all the weird robocalls that you have to screen. You get, the person who will not understand that you are not a printing company that they're trying to cut a deal with, all the weird stuff. The office manager part of it, you order office supplies, which honestly was felt like it did not take up a huge amount of my time. Someone sent an email and asks for this pen, and then you order it and you're done. 30 seconds. But yeah.
Am I wrong, Seth, that office supply ordering was big time drama back at Sterling and Lord? I just had this sudden sense memory flashback of a lot of stress over those office supply ordering. I
really think that goes back to the idea of what your expectations are going into a job, and where you draw the line between being humble and following the steps versus being a human who doesn't need to be trampled on doing silly things. So if there's a job where that person needs to be doing this and you're that person, then that's it. And so at Sterling Lord, one of the things that was difficult is that the assistants always had ill-defined communal jobs. And I think that was part of the big problem there. I mean, just like you, Kamei, in terms of designation of executive versus personal, I mean, a lot of people I hear have problems with, say, getting coffee for their bosses. I loved it because what happens is my boss would give me $20 and I would take a break and I would walk downstairs and they would say I could get coffee. I get them a coffee and I get myself a coffee and I come back and that was great. But that was like that I wouldn't get the dry cleaning. So it was sort of like, you have to find where you fall into those menial tasks. Especially when you're at the beginning, when you're in the menial task zone, if that makes sense.
I mean, the coffee is just the fuel that lets the brain run, I feel like, at that point. So in a sense, a necessary office supply.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like I've been saved from doing a lot of the menial tasks. Like I don't have to do the coffee runs. I do have to answer the phones a few days a week, which is by far my least favorite task. But I'm lucky in that a lot of the stuff that I do with my boss is like editorial and it's creative. So I'm like really happy about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, I feel like of all of us, I probably end up in the most menial PA stuff, right? Like I was getting dry cleaning, I was doing those coffee runs, and when clients come to the office, there's like a weird hosting thing that you need to learn how to do in terms of like getting people water, making them coffee and like those kind of things. And so a lot of those tasks were a big part of what I did and some other assistants did. And, I think it's really hard to figure out where those lines are, right? How much can you push back on, their expectations of, what an assistant's role is in terms of professional versus personal versus all those different things. So
and Sarah brings up a great point too with the editorial stuff, which was a part of my job that I really liked doing and that I kind of miss as Howard's assistant was doing backup reads and giving notes on things that he was considering or stuff that he'd gotten in from clients. I really miss doing nonfiction proposal stuff. That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about the growth of an assistant is that you, when you start, you're given a set number of tasks, and when you move on, you start doing your own stuff, so that adds work, right? But then at the same time, your boss starts trusting you editorially, starts trusting you to write, passes in their voice, and that I don't think that's a bad thing. It's as long as it's agreed upon what's being said, and various things like that. Taking those initiative roles and so the trust factor in there like really adds to some more things. So is there some stuff that you guys like before you made the shift over to being a floor agent or where you're at with or Sarah, like what are some of the things that you're doing now that you didn't do when you first came in? Unless I just described all of them.
One of the things that I do now that I didn't do at first was actually the contracts negotiation part of it. I don't do the major like publishing contracts, but I do negotiate like freelance contracts with like magazines and etc. And I think I just like write the notes and my boss doesn't even look at them at this point. So that's one thing. I think the editorial stuff and the more the like backup reads, all of that I've been doing since the beginning, basically.
Yeah. I think. Yeah, I mean, trust expands over time, right? As you demonstrate your confidence in the role, and I think one thing that happened more and more was that Howard would do things like say send me his subletter that he was going to send out to editors and say this project, is there anything else that you think you would put in or take out, or like a way that you'd rephrase things, and would make me feel like he took that into account as well, which I really appreciated. Just being asked my opinion about that as not an equal, but like a valued employee, I would say.
So would both of y'all read all the material that?
Not all of it. Not all of it. I feel like that'd be impossible. But
right.
But what about you, Sarah?
All of the material in terms of
submissions like that, which they're about to submit.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that helps in my case is that I knew my boss before I actually started working for him because I was an intern, and I was also like a very active intern in terms of asking questions. So I got to know people through that, and I think that's really helpful. And I think that's something that interns should do more, just based off my observations of interns in Hudson's.
I guess Chris, her boss is this amazing agent named Chris Paris Lamb. Chris is the opposite of me in that Sumit's like way less. He's like very, very, you know, he's like, go big, go home. I'm only going to go big. Like this, you know. So it's also probably a little bit helpful along those lines. Yeah, interesting.
By the material, I thought you meant, did you read all of the books that?
Oh, sorry, no.
That
Like
already
that,
sending
which
out.
is coming out the door. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, all the subletters. Yeah, I would read. Nonfiction proposals. I would read. Yeah.
Well, to jump forward a little bit, I mean, you know, Sarah, you mentioned you were taking on a client within your first month. How did that happen? And sort of, you know, were you always planning on doing that? You know, like, I would love. How was that process for you in terms of starting to take people on?
I was always very interested in having the freedom to explore taking on clients because I was kind of older when I started as an assistant, so didn't want to waste any time. But I think the first project that I represented was kind of an accident. It came in to Chris, and he didn't have time. So he was like, let's work on it together. And it ended up not really being together. Like, I just did it. So he let me do it. That's really what happened. So it was a lot of fun.
And, you know, it's okay if you don't want to answer this question, but I'm curious, was it a business negotiation with Chris in terms of, you know, the commission on that, or like how did that work? Was it purely under his name and, you know?
It was under my name. I think when we first started, we probably said we were going to do a half and half split, but then as it became more and more my project, I took the whole commission. But yeah, it wasn't so much a business negotiation. It really felt like he was handing it off to me as a matter of trust.
That's really wonderful. Hey, he sounds like a great boss, actually. And that's not too common in this business.
Yeah. And what Don Juan is definitely hinting at is that this is a bit of a tricky situation sometimes. You know, some bosses will want to be a little bit more involved in the money side of things, or will be asking you to do things that, like, theoretically you can imagine yourself taking commission off of. And it is something that, you know, at some point in time you have these conversations. Even the conversation of going from half to full, that looks like something that sort of happened. But sometimes you do need to have that conversation in that process. So it's a tricky part in there sometimes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've seen cases where the understanding was that the, you know, junior agent was going to get commission, and then the boss ends up just literally stealing it all at the end. And, you know, those are really, really rough scenarios. So anyway, sorry, Kimet, you were going to say.
Yeah, I was going to say that I feel lucky that I did not have to go through the situation you just described, that it was a very clear conversation between me and Howard from the beginning. Like, this is how it'll work for your first deal. And then subsequent to that, I was just on the commission structure that the rest of everyone is on, which I knew because I was the assistant and I processed all payments.
When were you sort of giving green light to start taking clients on? I mean, did you have that ability from the jump, or, you know, was it your interest that drove that moment, or was it more of a permission thing?
So in my conversations with Howard up front, it was clear that I think for at least the first 6 months or so, he was looking for someone just to be the assistant, since we were coming out of a small amount of chaos, and, you know, just to get that under control. And I was completely fine with that because I knew that it was a part of the business that I would need to learn, having not interned at an agency before, coming off of a job in publishing, but not in New York publishing. So I knew that there was a lot about that I would need to internalize. And then I kind of realized the scope of the role. I feel like being the assistant to the president of an agency, a lot of it is about making sure that person's time is spent making decisions that are important to the business as a whole. So the more that you can learn from them and the more things that you know how to answer in the way that they would answer them, the more you can take off of their plate and the more efficiently the business as a whole runs. And that was really how I saw my role for the first couple of years.
It sounds like you were a perfect assistant, like Howard's super lucky. Well, so like initiative driven and interested. And some people just want to show up and be like, I want to be an agent. I don't want to be here doing this assistant crap. I just want to move on. So it's really, I really commend that. I mean, and everyone should be listening.
I mean, this is part of the problem with transitioning out of that role, though, right?
Right.
Is that you have to start thinking of yourself as your own boss in a way when you move to agenting full time, and you're now managing your own time and not your boss's time, and those are very different things. And yeah, I forget where I was going with this actually.
I mean, yeah, that is like a really tricky transition in terms of learning how to be self-directed, right? Because suddenly picking projects, what you're editing, how you're spending your time become, who you're having lunch with, who you're meeting with, like all those things just become your own choices in a way that, aren't when you work for somebody, when you're on salary. And I think that can be a really tricky transition.
Yeah. It's two different roles. And to his credit, Howard kept pushing me to do things that would move me more in the direction to becoming a full agent. I remember him saying at one point what I thought was fairly early on, like, oh, you should start thinking about taking on your own clients. You have a good editorial eye. You can do that, and the entirety of this process, I feel like I've been the one saying, no, I don't wish to leave the nest. Please don't boot me from the nest. I don't know how to fly, even when it is apparent to people around me that I can actually just do the thing. Part of that is overcoming that sense of self-doubt, I guess, and realizing, oh, wait, I actually did do the thing. So obviously I can do the thing. Yeah.
Can you talk about getting your first client?
Sure. Sarah, do you want to go first, or?
She went. She spoke a bit about it.
Oh,
yeah.
How did you get it?
So I went to the Nebulas in 2015, and like talked to a bunch of people there, and was in a panel actually in the audience, and heard someone at the end at the Q&A ask a really smart question, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting question about economics. I'm going to talk to that person. And it turned out to be Canadian science fiction writer Derek Kunskin, who at that time had been published in Analog and Asimov's, and had a bunch of short fiction out, but who was working on a novel. And so he and I got to talking, and I said, yeah, when your novel is ready, I would love to see it. And then, when immediately after I got back from the con, he emailed me some of his short fiction. I read that, emailed him back and said, yeah, send me your novel. And then a few months later, he sent me his novel and read that. Asked Howard to read a little bit of it, actually, because I was still in that mindset of wanting someone else to render judgment upon a thing, still in that process of learning to trust my own gut, I guess. And Howard said, yeah, this seems worthwhile. I think you should pursue it. And yeah, went from there.
And Sarah, for you, I mean, I know you kind of talked a little bit about, how that project came in, but was it a process to convince that writer to, as Chris stepped back for, you to take that on, or was it just super smooth and you guys hit it off?
It was super smooth. Yeah, I mean, I was on the initial conversation with Chris, so they already sort of knew me and I was part of the conversation. So I think that made it very easy to transition. And after I did that project, it was sort of the same thing that Kunal was just talking about, where I sort of proved to myself that I could do it. So I started kind of reaching out to people on my own.
I have to say your list really is eclectic. It's really when you announce things you're submitting or that you have deals on, they're so different and creative and fun, and the kind of things that we're like, it's perfect. It's the kind of things where we're like, I didn't think of that. That's a great book. Those two things together is like how you make it in this place. So it's been really cool to watch that. So I guess one of the questions here is how do you go about looking for what you're like? Where do you mine? What's your stomping grounds?
That's a really good question. I mean, I just read voraciously, I guess. And I reach out to people that have been writing interesting things. Some people I find through social media, and I sort of look through their work and see whether it seems worthwhile to pursue. Really clients from everywhere. I think recommendations or like referrals are a big thing as well, which kind of comes from networking and going to lunch with people. But yeah, I think it's like there's a wide variety of places where I've been. picking people up.
Folks in the chat, please feel free to start dropping your questions in. We'd love to start transitioning to questions if you guys have any. But before we do that, I mean, Sarah, you mentioned networking. Networking is such like this important aspect of, a young agent's life, but any agent's life. Like, how was that? When did you start having lunches with people? How did you figure out who to have lunch with? Were people super rude to you when you started out trying to do that? Or was it like really easy to get people to pay attention to you? What did that process look like?
I'd say for lunches, once I started having some deals announced on Publishers Marketplace, etc., people started to reach out to me a little bit, mostly like younger editors, but some kind of more senior people as well. And then when I went out to lunch with them, I would ask who else I should have a lunch with that they work with. And I sort of kind of branch out from there. In terms of submitting stuff, though, I have had a few situations where editors are sort of like, "Who are you? Why are you calling me?" So that's I say that's more difficult than.
And what do you say? What do you say? Do you lean on yourself there, or do you lean on like working with Chris, or like how do you feel like is the way that you handle that? Because that's an interesting place to be.
Oftentimes, if I'm cold calling someone I've never met before, it's because one of my colleagues recommended that I submit to them. Right. So I'll sort of say, Seth thought this would be up your alley. And usually they calm down then. Yeah.
Well, Seth, I remember you kind of did a bold, smart thing, which was send everyone a copy of your book, right? Of Taya's book, and sort of establish yourself as someone who should be taken seriously in that way. I think finding, once you get that first deal, it gets a lot easier, I think, to start getting those lunches. But before that point, Sarah, were there like networking events that you were going to that were really useful? Or like, do you have any actually like concrete specific things you can point out? Like, I did this thing and it was super helpful.
Geez. I mean, I did join People of Color in Publishing, which definitely was helpful. Just like meeting people through that in a casual setting, even though it doesn't feel like networking, is definitely networking, and it was really helpful. Besides that,
do you think that our office party is as good as we think it is? Like, do you think that? Do you think that that's like a good? Like, we have a yearly party that we like really are proud of, and we invite lots of editors there, and I will say, sadly, it really shows like a makeup of an agency whereby really it's mainly like adult literary editors. Mm-hmm. Like, I can put on some sci-fi on the list, but sometimes I feel bad, right? Or children, whatever. I'm just saying it's a big part of the game as well as those parties. And I'm just curious to know, like, do you think that really helps, or is that just like fun times?
I think it's helpful for the first hour before people have had their like third drink or so.
Or the last hour.
Too real.
Wow. Yeah. Amazing.
That last hour where you just end up on this, like, go into some second bar with a group of people, and like now you're all best friends, and like
Yeah, if you could edit out the middle of a party.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When I remember, Seth, like back in the day, assistants would sort of actually collectively organize networking events. Like, two people would be like, all right, we're doing this thing. We're going to be at a bar. We're inviting a bunch of young editors, young agents, and sort of doing these sort of ad hoc mixers. Is that a thing that still happens, or was that just like...
By the way that we did that was most effective is that we would also pair up with an editorial group.
Yeah.
And then they would invite agents and that would come together. Y'all can do, there's some of that. There was some of that, right?
Yeah, at Gernert, the assistants have been having sort of after work drinks on our patio where we invite like an editorial team, usually like associate editors and below, to sort of get to know some younger people who are in our cohort in publishing. And that's been really helpful. And I met people that I probably wouldn't have met otherwise.
Right.
Yeah. And
Kimei, did you do drinklings? Like, what was your take on that for stuff?
Yeah. My take on that was, an editor told me about it, whom I really like, and I was glad to have that tip. And I think it was useful in the sense of getting, part of the problem is that I had already met a bunch of sci-fi and fantasy people at cons. By the time I started going to Drinklings. So Drinklings was helpful in the sense of meeting a few more of these people, but after a certain point, I felt like I started to see the same people there. And yeah, there are also actually a bunch of sci-fi and fantasy reading series in New York, which was helpful to meet writers more so, I would say.
Right.
Yeah, and so that helped.
It's one of the nice things about SFF is we do have the con structure, and it's such a smaller pool of editors that you need to know that it is entirely possible to fit all of us in one bar, you know what I mean, at the same time, which happens regularly, actually. So
yeah, and you make a really great point. For we had mentioned this in other episodes, but like when you want to do a different type of thing, you want to do literary fiction, you want to do middle grade, you basically have to find a different con, party, lunch system to go to. Many more people that you have to round up, and it's a lot of work. So the final question I have before we go into these things is
one last thing I want to say sort of on the networking thing before we move off of it is we've mentioned a lot of bars and parties and cons and BarCon and those kind of things. The thing I really want to flag is, there's a lot of alcohol involved in those situations. Please, young agents, don't feel like you have to drink. Please be aware of your safety. Please be aware of, the fact that maybe not everyone in those situations is a good actor. I think I'm comfortable saying this. Drinklings in particular has had some problems with certain actors within those communities who have turned out to be highly problematic. That's not an event I recommend anymore, even though I was very involved in the early days of that event. And, just pay attention, protect yourself, talk to your friends, kind of know who those people are, and do not feel pressured to actually consume alcohol at those events if you don't want to. And, there's a lot of ways to network that don't involve, being 25 and getting drunk in unsafe situations. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think it's a major problem in our industry that we're so alcohol fueled in terms of the networking side of things. And it's one of the things I really think that we collectively need to start learning how to fix. So we don't have this problem coming up over and over and over again, year after year after year. So sorry, my little rant here.
Yeah, to which I'll append my footnote, which is that it is honestly nobody's business. Like you can order a club soda with lime and it looks like a G&T, it looks like a vodka soda. It is no one's business. You don't have to announce that you're not drinking. You can just quietly do it and no one will bother you about it, in my experience.
Or, one little tip from me on that note is I think people think of me as someone who does drink a lot at these events. I don't actually. I have one, maybe two drinks, but, I'll get a whiskey at the beginning of the night and sort of nurse it over the course of many hours. These are not events where you should be getting drunk. These are professional events, and it behooves all of us to continue to remain professional. Sometimes having that drink in your hand is a very convenient thing in terms of a social prop in a lot of ways, but get a club soda with a lime in it, get one drink and nurse it for a long time. There's a lot of strategies. Even get that drink and have it refilled with soda water or whatever it is. There's a lot of ways in which I think you can learn to mitigate that drinking culture and still participate in a networking event. And it sucks that we have to do this, but for me, that's been my experience of a very useful channel. Anyways.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm glad I think that I came into the industry when I had already had a solid few years under my belt of men pressuring me to drink in social situations. This is just like a thing that happens, I feel like, in life. So my feeling was that I didn't really need to do that, and it was not conducive to doing my job even. So you can just not. Like it is very much an opt-in part of the business, and I think people don't realize that. Like you can just not.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for focusing on that. I mean, and there's also other places, coffee, lunches, other things.
Ice cream. I would like more of these things to take place in like ice cream parlors. I think that would be awesome.
I think that should be a real thing. I mean, like there was one editor for lunch that was like, listen, I love fried chicken. And she was like, me too. And so we would only get like crazy New York fried chicken. Okay, I know we don't have tons of time, but I still had one follow-up question I think is important, which is, and I don't want to just like brush off on that subject. So I'm really glad we talked about that. And we should do a whole section talking about that more. But I want to know about the role of your bosses in your expanding into the agency side. It looks like we're going to have to move all the questions when it comes to like the transition from assistant to an agent to a whole thing, which we're going to do. But like when you're taking lunches, were your bosses 100% supportive? Did they want to know who you were going with? Were they like, you're out a little bit too much? Like what where was your boss's role in that actual like support going to cons? Were they pushing you in that direction? It's like what was that role that they had in this kind of situation?
Oh, sure, I'll go first. When I started taking lunches, I feel like my boss was super supportive. There wasn't a lot of, or there isn't a lot of oversight on that. I only go to lunch probably 2 times a week, not necessarily because my boss is breathing down my neck about it, but because it's like disruptive to my day as well.
Yeah.
So 2 times a week is probably like what I can handle. But yeah, I think there's not really a lot of restriction for me in terms of that.
Yeah. I mean, in the sense, if I were taking 3-hour lunches, I think it would have been an issue, maybe. But in the sense of like have common sense and get the rest of your stuff done, I don't think it was an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess I asked the question because it became an issue for me, and so maybe I was looking at some people. I remember my boss very clearly being like, "You go out to way too many lunches, and if you are at these lunches, which a lot of times take 2 hours, because just in New York, just traveling or whatever, because when you're a junior person, you often it's this weird game. You also often have to be the one who travels to the editor, right?
Yeah.
And then it switches or whatever. Then he was like, "You have to stay later," and I was like, "Whoa, okay." So, but I remember that, so I was just curious. I guess it's part of the balance.
I mean, it can be tough. I mean, I work from home from Brooklyn, so a lunch, even just a 45-minute hour lunch, it's 3 hours out of my day because I got to go into Lower Manhattan, meet up for lunch and then come back, and it can be a big chunk. And a lot of those lunches do not run 45 minutes to an hour. I fairly regularly end up in a 3-hour lunch, and it sounds decadent, but it's not. Like, you're talking business and you're doing work at those things. It's sometimes really good because you're building a relationship if that lunch is running long. It's funny that sometimes you just lose your entire day to one lunch meeting, and that can be really tough, even as someone who's just managing my own time. But
And I guess it's worth mentioning the LA aspect because we talk about New York all the time. So like similar to that, if I have a meeting in Burbank, which is like very far away, then I just say that's my day. I'm going to have meetings in Burbank because it's that far away. And I feel like that's another kind of game you can play. Okay, so listen, it's 52 minutes in. I think we might be willing to go a little bit over, but let's ask some questions here. Do you want to start? Do you have one in mind, or?
So I'm going to say, like Seth said, so woo-woo, that's a really great question, and I think we do want to do a whole episode about the financial consequences of making that transition. So I know it's an important question you want to talk about, but we're going to hold off on that for a second because it's a big topic, and I think we want to be pretty thoughtful and careful about how we approach that. Okay, so Carrie has a great question. Once you started agenting, how many clients did you take on in that first year? Did you have a goal of how many you want to bring on by end of year 1?
Good question.
Yeah. I mean, my sense of that transition is not hard and fast, really, actually, since I took on my first client when I was still an assistant and sold those books while I was still Howard's assistant. So I don't have a clear sense of like, oh, well, this is when I started doing that necessarily, because when I started, I was still assisting Howard, like, on salary. And so my sense of the transition has been more gradual almost. But yeah.
What about you, Sarah? Did you have targets that you were setting for yourself?
I think I did have targets that were unrealistic. I think agenting is very like individualized, right? Like there's no agent that does the job exactly the same as someone else. So I think it takes a long time to figure out your own rhythms and your own like workflow, especially when you're also assisting someone. So, I mean, I think the actual number of clients I took on in the first year that I was taking on clients was maybe 4. I don't remember what my target was, but it was crazy. So
I remember my boss very specifically saying, like, the first one you take on, like, really feel like you're into it, and then just spend time getting to know that thing. So I think I had one for 6 or 7 months before I even started looking elsewhere, and I think in the first 2 years I might have had only 1 to 3 And then it just like, then I was like, and I'm here, and like ran
Yeah.
and did it and did everything. But
And this touches on the topic that we just said we weren't really going to talk a lot about. But when you start making that transition to commission only and agenting full time, there's a lot of pressure to start bringing people on more aggressively at that point, right? Because you need stuff to sell, you need stuff to work on, right? So especially when you're there and you're feeling that pressure of, oh, this is all I'm doing now, all my time is dedicated to clients that I choose and work with, there's quite a bit of pressure to start bringing people on. And I think it can be as much of a mistake to take people on too quickly, without really knowing what your taste is yet and who you want to work with and those kind of things, as it can be to not take enough people on and therefore not have enough income to keep going.
I'm realizing too that I've completely forgotten to talk about a hugely important piece of this for me, which is that at the time that I was starting to think about letting myself be pushed out of the nest and going full time, Howard and I had a conversation where he said, Kate, our Vice President, Kate McKean, might not want to be handling this piece of our audio business anymore. Is that something that you would be interested in doing? And that is actually a big part of what I do day to day now. Not when I was the assistant, but has been a big part after the transition, is handling audio for Howard's clients as well as my own. And so that has been helpful in kind of smoothing over that big anxiety gap of, oh, how can I do this and afford to exist in New York? So that helps a lot, actually. Yeah.
I think that's something that's tricky to bring up to your boss when you're getting hired, but it is something you should have a conversation at some point about, is where, is whether, how they handle your transition and whether you can have that kind of support. So this actually leads right into Eleanor's question. Because of the nature of author-agent relationships, a partner for your career, I worry it would be disingenuous to take on clients less than 100% sure I want to agent for the long haul. But I also don't want to stagnate as an assistant in perpetuity. Any thoughts there? So, that's a great question. And ultimately, I really believe that it's a fair question. And I think some writers are going to get the bad end of the stick here, the short end of the stick, the whatever it is. But I don't think you can know you want to be an agent until you take on people. In fact, I would say that until you have not just sold a book, but even had a measure of success, do you not fully understand the joys? And you want to know the positive and the negatives of it. So you sell a book, yay, you get some money for it, yay, but then the book doesn't work or you have problems here. When you have a successful run, then you get the full thing. So basically that could happen for a long time, and we can't assume might not happen for a long time. So you can't assume that that's going to be the case. But I do think, and this is me just speaking here, I would love to know what everyone else thinks, but I think that you kind of have to be willing to sort of go all in, with the assumption that it's like you don't do a job halfway because your foot's out the door because you don't know, right? I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think people leave the business for a whole host of reasons, right? Like if I, God forbid, got really ill or something, then I would have to talk about that with my clients and they would have to figure something else out. So I don't know. To me, it's just sort of, I don't think that is going to happen, but if it does, everyone will deal with it at that point. Yeah, I don't know. I don't worry about this much, weirdly.
Yes. Seth, to your point of not really knowing what you're getting into until you're into it, I think one thing that people don't talk about a lot about agenting is the emotional heft of it. If your client suffers a rejection, their book isn't doing well, you're also shouldering that burden with them, and you're the nexus for all of these people's individual burdens, and that can be very hard, and you have to be very thick-skinned in a way, and that's something that you don't really know until you feel it.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Yeah. You do kind of live and die with your client's work, right? Yeah. But I don't have that sense of, I don't know. I don't have that sense of well, what if I weren't doing this? I guess.
Mm-hmm. Taking on that first client is really a leap of faith, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a leap of faith for that writer in you, and it's a leap of faith for you in that writer. Every client you take on is that leap of faith, right? And one of the things you're considering at that point is this the role for me? And you really aren't going to know until you try it, right? And the first client I took on back when I was an assistant, I did put them in exactly this position because I took them on and then realized, actually, I don't think I want to do this. Ironically, I came back around to it. But, that first person I worked with, I ended up leaving agenting at that point. And it's funny, she just referred a client to me, a potential client to me a couple weeks ago. And it was really nice to hear that she still, doesn't bear any ill will towards me. But even as an editor, I had the same thing where there's a number of writers, a number of projects that I was working on who, I still feel very intensely about those projects, but there was a number of things that I left mid-series, right? In part because I was pursuing other opportunities at the time. It is fundamentally part of this business. There's so many writers I know, at least half of the writers out there are not with the first agent that they started out with for a variety of reasons. Many of them because that person left the business after a year or two. And it is one of the risks about going with a junior agent, but also that person can grow with you over time. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that too. So
I guess
I wouldn't worry about it too much. A lot of those people are still trucking along and are hugely successful. So sorry, Kimei.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess too, I want to acknowledge that I decided to start agenting full time not that long after the election. And at that point I was sort of like, anyone can do anything. This person can be president, apparently. So, like, who's going to stop me? Nobody.
That's true.
Anarchy.
That's true. Though what's funny is that there are other agenting positions in the world where you actually do need like a license, and we don't. So anyone can do it. Right. I think the real thing one of the big things to take away from this, Eleanor, is that is that you don't want to let your client down or sabotage that client by being halfway in. Like, you take someone on, you go 100% in until the moment that you're gone. And I think that that's sort of the way that we should look there. Yeah. Do we have time for one more, or what do you think?
I really want to speak to this one, so let's do it if you guys don't mind hanging out for a couple more minutes. Sarah Nicholas asks, you've all said the word young quite a bit in this conversation. As someone who's trying to come in my mid to late 30s, how do I ask, am I out of luck? The short answer is no. And we say young agent all the time. For me, at least, I don't mean literally young in terms of years that you've been on this planet. It is an unfortunate part of our lexicon that actually I want to be better about removing, right? Like, we say baby agent all the time, or baby editor. And what we mean by that isn't that you're 20. It means that you are new to the business or new to this role. It's quite frankly a shitty thing to say. We should stop saying it.
Can we just replace all this with bird imagery? Can we all just be fledgling until we're not? Like,
fledgling is good, actually. And I like your nest metaphor of Howard gently being like, you can fly. Yeah. So I do like that imagery. It is definitely not something that is age limited in that way. I mean, it's always hard to start a new career when you're mid 30s, but it's definitely doable. I mean, yes, I was in publishing for a long time, but when I became an agent, I was 30 something. I don't remember what off the top of my head, but and I'd been out of this side of the business for several years at that point, right? So it was a thing where I was kind of rolling back into it. You can take on that roles. I know multiple people who become assistants in their 30s. I know people who became editors, after having two other careers in their 40s, right? I know someone who was a professional chef for years before becoming an editor. And my understanding is he was pretty I think he was in his 30s by the time he started in publishing, right? There's a ton of people who have had that experience. Don't let us saying the word young feel like we're pushing you out of the business. We're going to work on removing that from our language and lexicon, because I do think it is, isolating and
I agree. In that way. I agree. However, and to speak a little bit to the truth on that as well, like in terms of interviews or having resumes come my way, I actually don't ever pause in terms of age. But the question that I do have do come across with people who are a little bit older is that they, rightfully so, especially if you're coming from a place where you've had a career elsewhere, you tend to have more that you need to support. You tend to have a stronger need to basically be knowing that this is the career you want, having that money, coming in. And so for me, the question is never the age. It's always, are you okay being an assistant for a couple years?
Yeah.
Are you okay with that? And sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is yes. So it's really just about where you are in your needs as a human being and how this is going to transfer. And one of the hard things about getting into any position is that sometimes you have to start at a certain place. Dongwan coming in had experience, had his connections already in place, and so it's it's tricky. Yeah.
I mean, that said, when I was interviewing at a couple agencies, when I was making the choice to come back, there was definitely one agent who was like, "Hey, you've done all these different roles. What is there for me and for writers to believe that you're going to stick with this over the long term?" Because, I think that person looked at the list of things that I'd done in my career and thought that there wasn't the sense of commitment to it, right? So having done other things, I'm not going to say it's easy, right? I mean, nothing in the business is easy, right? Like,
publishing is hard.
Publishing is hard. That is a thing that will be used against you, fairly or unfairly, but there's a lot of things that get used against you in this business. So I wouldn't let that stop you. Be aware that it can be a blocker. Be aware that people will be shitty about it. But people find all kinds of ways to be shitty to you in this business. So, I think being prepared for that and being aware of it is important. But again, yes, you absolutely have that opportunity. That chance exists. It's not always easy, but it's there.
I mean, when you're applying to a bunch of jobs too, you're pitching yourself, right? You're selling a narrative of yourself. So not to sound like a sociopath or anything, but you are trying to convey to
we
people,
pitch for a living.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, and anything that you are looking at as a weakness, try to reinterpret as a strength, I would say. I mean, is it a weakness in publishing, or is it statistically unlikely, technically, that my degree is in economics and not like English or history? Yeah, but do I care? No, not really. Do I think it is actually kind of a strength in this business? Yes. Yeah. So you can say, yes, I'm older, but also, yes, I have experience in these different areas and have an understanding of this other field, maybe, that other people in publishing don't have. You need to find your niche and evolve into that niche, or figure out what niches there are and whether you like any of them. And that's just kind of it.
Right.
You can't have the mindset of like, am I out of luck?
Right.
You have to look at things and say, is there an opportunity for a thing that I want to do? Is there that match? And then do that, or maybe there isn't. Like,
yeah,
I don't think it's that there isn't, but you have to figure out what it is, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's great. And I mean, I guess we should wrap there. But before we do on to that, before Dongwan ends, Sarah, Kim-May, is there any final things that you want to make sure that we didn't have a chance to talk about that you just want to make sure you share support to any of the viewers that we have or will have? The answer could be no. And
I don't think so.
Yeah, I guess just the point I just made, that yeah, if you are from a marginalized background in publishing, that I see that as actually a great strength in a sense. That you do bring to it a perspective that is not what everyone has already seen, and everyone is always looking for the new great thing, I feel like. So
yeah, it's always about how do you take the thing that makes you distinct and make it an asset, as opposed to a thing that people will use against you, right? And people will try, but if you can try and find ways to flip that on them before they get there, sometimes that can be an effective strategy. Again, I'm not saying that's easy to do. I'm not saying it's going to work all the time, but at least try and figure out how to frame it ahead of time, so that they can't attack you with it as much as possible. So
yeah, and you have to accept those parts of yourself and work with them.
Exactly. So. Okay, cool. Thank you all for tuning in to Agent Talk with Seth and Dongwan. And thank you to our wonderful guests, Kim-May and Sarah. We've really enjoyed having you guys on. I hope that all of you have enjoyed this conversation and hopefully learned something from it as well. So let's start with Sarah. Sarah, where can people find you on the internet?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Litboll, Litboll. Yeah, it's on screen. So, and I'm also on the Gernert Company website. If you guys aren't authors, but if you have author friends who are thinking of querying, look at my bio there.
Excellent. And Kim-May, where can people find you?
Yeah, I am
I jumped the gun. Sorry.
Oh, well, okay, fine. You can look at the screen, or I'm at KM Kirtland. Some other jerk took K Kirtland already, but Yeah, I'm at Cam Kirtland on Twitter, or likewise, you can find me on the Moreheim Literary website, which has my likes and dislikes and submissions and our general submission guidelines on it.
Great. And Seth?
Hello, you can find me, Seth S. Fishman, both the website as well, and also Instagram and this and so on and so forth. Looking forward to seeing you there.
And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Dongwan. You can see me tweeting there about my various thoughts about the business and probably about some dumb TV show I'm watching. And I have a newsletter at publishingishard.substack.com. Feel free to sign up there. And we will be back next week, next Friday, once again at 1 p.m. Eastern and 10 a.m. Pacific. And if you have questions, you can email us at agenttalkshow@gmail.com. And until then, be good, read more, and publish better. Thanks, y'all.
Bye, everyone. And thanks to our guests.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Okay.